This is the only episode of Drive-Thru Towns where you cannot drive through the town. There is no road to Seldovia. There has never been a road to Seldovia. You get there by ferry, a water taxi out of Homer, 45 minutes across Kachemak Bay, past the halibut boats and the sea otters floating on their backs with the sublime indifference of creatures who've never once considered a highway. Or you get there by floatplane, dropping out of the sky onto a bay that on a clear day reflects the Kenai Mountains so perfectly that the water and the air become the same impossible blue. Either way, you arrive by water or by air, which is exactly how people have been arriving here since 1787, which is exactly how people will still be arriving here long after the last person in this story is gone. Seldovia didn't lose its road in an earthquake. Seldovia didn't lose its road to economic collapse. Seldovia never had a road. And that fact, that single stubborn geographical fact, is both the reason this town exists and the reason it almost ceased to. Hit the brakes, or in this case, kill the engine. You're going to need a boat. I'm Andrew Wilcox, and this is Drive-Thru Towns. From Homer, the end of the road on the Kenai Peninsula, the last stop before the continent runs out of reasons to continue. Seldovia is visible across the bay on clear days, a cluster of buildings on a low bluff, a small harbor, the suggestion of a community arranged around a waterfront that no longer looks quite like it did in the photographs. The photographs show a boardwalk, elevated, wooden, running the full length of the waterfront above the tidal zone, because Seldovia's tidal fluctuation is dramatic, the kind of dramatic where low tide exposes 100 yards of mudflat, and high tide wants to reclaim everything below a certain line. And the only practical architecture is one built above the argument. The boardwalk was Seldovia's main street, its commercial district, its public square, its identity. Everything that mattered about the town happened on or adjacent to that boardwalk. The canneries, the stores, the bars, the fish buyers, all of it elevated above the tide on pilings driven into the Kachemak Bay floor, weathered gray by salt air, planked with boards that announced each footstep with a particular hollow resonance. The sound of a town suspended between land and sea, belonging fully to neither. The boardwalk is gone. The photographs are all that's left of it. And the way it disappeared, the sequence of events that took a working, living, breathing Alaskan waterfront and replaced it with a concrete seawall and a beach buried under fill, is a story about the specific cruelty of being killed twice by two completely different causes in the same decade. The name is Russian. Of course it's Russian. Seldovia, Herring Bay, named by Russian fur traders who established a post here in 1787 or 1788, making Seldovia one of the earliest European settlements in Alaska, predating American ownership of the territory by 80 years. The Russians came for sea otters, primarily, that insatiable imperial hunger for fur that had driven Russian exploration across Siberia and into the Pacific, and eventually all the way to California, leaving a trail of decimated otter populations and place names that would outlast the empire by centuries. The formal name of the Russian post was Alexandrovskaya. Say it again, Alexandrovskaya. Nobody called it that, though. They called it the Herring Bay because the herring were the real economy, the real sustenance, The protein that fed the workers who chased the otters that funded the empire that named the bay that became the town that built the boardwalk. The herring fishery predated the Russians. The Kachemak Bay Alutiiq people had been harvesting herring here since time before their memory, drying them, rendering their oil, trading them across the Gulf of Alaska in an indigenous commercial network that the Russian traders tapped into rather than replaced. The herring were the original currency of this specific piece of coastline. And like all currencies built on a single commodity, it was subject to the specific disaster of that commodity's collapse. By the mid 20th century, Seldovia's herring fishery was gone. It had been overfished. The particular efficiency of industrial fishing applied to a population of fish that had no mechanism to negotiate the terms of its own harvest. The herring that had named the bay sustained the Russian post, fed the cannery workers, and built the boardwalk were simply gone. The town had to pivot to salmon, to halibut, to the particular resilience of fishing communities that have no other option but to find the next fish. By the middle of the 20th century, Seldovia had figured itself out. Population over 2,000, enormous for a roadless community on the far side of Kachemak Bay. A school, churches, a hospital, cold storage for the fish, a cannery, the boardwalk running its full length along the waterfront, the commercial heart of a community that had learned to treat its isolation not as a deficit, but as a defining characteristic. You couldn't drive to Seldovia. You could only arrive. And the people who arrived, who chose the boat or the floatplane over the highway, were, by self selection, the kind of people who meant to be there. Seldovia was, by accounts of everyone who lived there in that era, a town that worked. Then Homer got a road. The Sterling Highway reached Homer in 1950. Suddenly, the town across the bay had a land connection to Anchorage, to the road system, to supply chains and commerce and mobility that defined connected Alaska. Homer boomed. In Seldovia, the town across the water, the town you still had to reach by boat, began to feel, for the first time, like a limitation rather than a feature. Families moved to Homer. Businesses moved to Homer. Young people moved to Homer. The population that had been over 2,000 began to drop, not in a catastrophe, not in a single dramatic event, but in the slow, quiet, individually rational exodus of people choosing connection over isolation, one family at a time, one business at a time. The boardwalk emptying incrementally, the cannery running at reduced capacity, the particular mathematics of a community losing critical mass. The highway didn't demolish Seldovia. It just made Seldovia unnecessary. And then, before the town could figure out how to be necessary again, the earth moved. Good Friday, 1964. You've heard this check, check, check. You've heard this earthquake before on the show. 5:36 p.m. Magnitude 9.2, the second largest earthquake ever recorded. In Seldovia, the ground dropped. Not as dramatically as in Portage, not as completely, but enough. 3 to 4 feet of subsidence. The land simply sinking, compacting, settling into a new and lower relationship with the sea. 3 to 4 feet doesn't sound catastrophic until you understand that Seldovia's entire commercial infrastructure was calibrated to a specific tidal relationship, and that relationship had now shifted by the height of a kitchen counter. The boardwalk, already economically wounded, already operating at reduced capacity, already mourning the families who'd moved to Homer, was now flooding at high tides that had previously passed harmlessly beneath it. The federal government offering reconstruction money, the condition the boardwalk had to go. Urban renewal, Alaska style. The Army Corps of Engineers filled the tidal zone with material dredged from the harbor, burying the beach, burying the pilings, burying the ghost of the boardwalk's footprint under concrete and fill in a seawall that protected the new ground level from the tides that had defeated the old one. When it was done, Seldovia looked different. Not destroyed, different. The buildings remained, the harbor remained. The people who hadn't left already remained. But the waterfront had defined the town's identity. The elevated, resonant, salt gray wooden architecture of a community suspended between sea and land was gone, replaced by something solid, practical, permanent, and utterly without memory. The town that emerged from the earthquake and the reconstruction was functional. It just wasn't quite Seldovia anymore. Kristin Hanna wrote a novel called The Great Alone. You may have read it. It sold millions of copies. It is the story of a family that moves to a remote, roadless, Alaskan community on a place accessible only by boat or floatplane, a place of extraordinary natural beauty and claustrophobic social intensity, a place where the isolation that attracts certain kinds of people also traps them, where the darkness of the Alaskan winter becomes a pressure that the most fragile people cannot withstand. The town in the novel is called Kaneq. Kaneq is, by every description in the book, unmistakably Seldovia. The bay, the mountains, the boardwalk. The novel describes a boardwalk with the specific hollow resonance of feet on elevated planking that Seldovia lost in 1964 and has not had since. In the novel, the boardwalk still exists, which means that Kristin Hanna's Seldovia is more Seldovia than the current Seldovia. That the most accurate portrait of this town in popular culture is a work of fiction set in a version of the town that the earthquake and the reconstruction erased 60 years ago. The real town doesn't have a boardwalk. The fictional town does. And millions of readers know the fictional town and have never heard of the real one. Here's what Seldovia is now. Under 300 people, the highest median age of any community on the Kenai Peninsula, a harbor that still works, a Russian Orthodox church that still stands, a small boat harbor and a boardwalk, a shorter, newer recreational boardwalk, nothing like the old one, and a slough trail through the wetlands where the birding is exceptional and the silence is the specific silence of a place that has made its peace with being overlooked. No road, still no road. The ferry runs from Homer twice a week in winter, more often in summer. The float planes come and go, and people who live there chose it consciously every day. Chose the water taxi and the float plane and the 45 minutes across the bay over the highway and the connection and the commerce and everything Homer represents. They chose the island that isn't an island. They chose the boardwalk that isn't there. They chose the Herring Bay long after the herring left. Seldovia has been killed twice. Once by a highway it couldn't reach, once by an earthquake it couldn't predict. It is still there. Smaller, quieter, changed almost beyond recognition from the town and the photographs and the novel. But there, still answering to its Russian name, still surrounded by water on 3 sides and mountains on the 4th, still requiring a boat to reach, which means that arriving in Seldovia is still, after 230-something years, an act of intention. You don't end up there. You choose it. This has been Drive-Thru Towns. I'm your host, Andrew Wilcox. Special thanks to Chloe Jones for the music. Follow the podcast for upcoming episodes. Connect with me on Instagram at 50 State Family. Find me on LinkedIn under Wilcox Legal or email me at wilcoxlegal@gmail.com. And I'll see you on the next road.
'Cause I was wandering free on an American dream with a million things to see and do. But it's all good, I'm fine. Had the time of my life 'cause I did it all.